Hello there everybody, my name is Bloomer Brown and welcome to episode 3 of Kerbal Space Program Retrograde, a nostalgic playthrough of career mode in 0.24. Now, when last we left off, we were with the Minmus lander, which, interestingly enough, was landed on the surface of Minmus. And with its scientific experiments conducted, I decided it was time to return this thing to the surface of Kerman. And so I light up the engines and ever so carefully begin guiding myself skyward, if Minmus in fact has a sky. Taking care not to slam myself into this mountain range that is just over there. Now, in the last episode, I was kind of talking about the Delta V of this lander, and that is, of course, because I know what was about to happen, because this was all recorded before I began editing the last episode. So as you can see, I am flying in the wrong direction, or relatively speaking, the wrong direction around Minmus. And being a little bit of a fool, I decided that I was going to try and correct this, which results in me burning quite aggressively, in fact, to try to swing the orbit around in the opposite direction, and I should have just left good enough alone. So it is quite an aggressive burn, and I managed to make my way through about half of the fuel that I was planning to use to get this thing safely back to Kerman. And so yeah, when I get out to orbit, I realise that I have only about 103 meters per second to try and do a burn that needs something a little more. And so what I do is I spend a bit of time making my way through a number of orbits, trying to find a firing solution that will bring me somewhat closer to Kerman. Eventually I decide that I am going to slingshot myself off the moon, and in about 19 days actually, we encounter a position that will bring us around the moon, and it's going to cost us about 69 meters per second, which leaves us with not enough to make a burn towards the atmosphere. But I decide to go for it anyway, because the less Delta V we have to spend in getting out here for a rescue mission, the better, I think, because we are of course determined to get this probe back. Clearly there is something wrong with the flight computer, and we want to dissect it and make sure that something like this doesn't happen on another probe. And so, with the Minmus lander taking the long way around, as they say, I jump back to the KSC and begin testing a rover. So, the landing gear on this thing is provided to us by KW Rocketry, and it actually has some motors in the wheels, which enables us to drive around so long as we can provide it with enough electricity. Incidentally, we have a new Kerbal on the roster, that being Valentina, who mysteriously arrived at the base looking for a job, and because we're a little bit short of recruits at the moment, we decided to accept her, and she has fitted in perfectly as part of the team. She gets on very well with Jeb, Bill and Bob. It's almost as though she knows them somehow. Of course, they deny that they have ever met. And so we begin a little bit of a scientific survey of the area around the KSC and try not to tip the rover over in the process. So as we do the experiments, in these older versions, we only have 3 biomes around the KSC, that being landed at the KSC, around the runway, and of course the launch pad. So we are not getting as much out of this as we would in later versions. So we get Bob out here to begin the science scramble as he gathers up all that data. The advantage of the reason, of course, that I am trying to put a mobile laboratory on wheels is because it enables us to reset the experiments. And as I'm speaking, it seems that Bob Kerman has managed to slide off the top of the rover itself. And Valentina, thinking quickly on her feet, decides to lower the landing gear, or rather raise the landing gear, and drop the entire rover into something of a sitting position. And Bob makes his way around trying to gain purchase on something so that he may be able to climb aboard. So I suppose the purpose of all of this is to test out the capabilities of this and work out some of the bugs, which is much easier to do on the surface of Kerman rather than launching something like this into space and discovering that you cannot get back in if you fall out. So I think some changes are necessary in order to facilitate Bob Kerman. And so, with some changes made, we are back out on the runway once again and are being treated to a live demonstration of what Valentina is calling the Bob Kerman Maneuver. More overt and slightly less dignified than the Picard Maneuver, but it should nonetheless prove valuable in case Bob Kerman becomes incapacitated during the course of exercising his scientific duties, allowing him to return to the relative safety of the mobile laboratory. So essentially what I have done is slapped a couple of ladders onto the side there to allow Bob to climb back up onto the top if he falls from the roof of this thing while collecting the data. That should be less of a problem if we do bring this thing out to the moon, because of course the gravity is much lower and our RCS pack should be able to help us jump a distance like that. In fact, I think we could probably jump it from a standstill without engaging the EVA pack. So, with Bob Kerman back inside, it is time to take this out and do a little exploration around the neighbourhood. So as I said, this thing weighs in at over 7 tons, and while I could kind of launch it now, it would be better to wait until I start unlocking some of the 2.5 meter parts. Although I have unlocked some of them already, though I haven't any stack decouplers or fairings. Technically speaking, I don't actually need the fairings to launch this because the aerodynamics are very, very different in version 2.4. Or version 0.24, I should say. But I want to kind of keep things looking somewhat reasonable when we're launching these missions. As we're driving along, time acceleration seems to work relatively well on the flat ground, but if we are to get into some slightly rougher terrain, getting above 2 or 3 times physical time acceleration does cause some issues for us, that being flipping the thing over. As I say, it may be worth trying to extend the wheelbase a little bit, maybe make this thing a little bit wider so that we are less prone to flipping over, and maybe trying to bring the centre of mass down a little bit, perhaps mounting those mystery goos on the bottom, and we may actually put in a second materials bay on it as well. But as I say, that is the purpose of running a mission like this before sending it out into space. We can work out all of the kinks and bugs before stranding ourselves on the surface of a planet and having a failed mission. Once again, we see Bob struggling with the ladders there. There seems to be some sort of an issue with that ladder, and perhaps I need to move it up or move it down a little bit on the back to facilitate him getting in and out from that material study. And so onward we go until we reach what is known as a transitional biome. Now the way that biomes are mapped in this old version of Kerbal is that it is something resembling a colour map. And basically we have wandered into a region where two different biomes overlap, that being the shores and the grasslands. And so what that has done is it has generated this phantom biome, tundra biome here, which you would typically only find closer to the poles. And because we're not getting as much science out of the KSC as we would in later versions, I've decided to exploit it rather than waiting until we make a mission up north or down south looking for the tundra. And we see Bob struggling away there again. He decides that it is probably time to plant a flag without writing a message on it, actually. So we're going to re-grab that and try to replace it with something of a fitting message to memorialize this. A tundra here, you say? That took quite a while. Luckily, we brought plenty of snacks aboard the rover. The survey appears to be going well, almost as well as the development of the Bob Kerman Manouver. Just don't tell him it is not as cool as the Picard Maneuver. Though it is, of course, debatable whether or not Bob Kerman would be familiar with the exploits of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, him being a Kerbal, and humans, of course, being fictional aliens from a distant planet called Earth. So we continue on with the survey, and we arrive towards the end of it. This is the Highlands. I have visited the grasslands, gathered all of the data from there, and I have been driving because I don't really want to push up the time acceleration and chance my luck too much. I've been driving this on relatively slow levels of time acceleration, and it has taken a while. So this is going to be the last stop along the way, because I'm quite frankly getting bored at this stage. So we get Bob out once again to do the science shuffle, and he jumps down to plant a flag. The Highlands. If these be Highlands, then what are those? So I had thought about making my way up to the mountains with this thing, but it is really, really rather unstable. And in fact, even as we lower the landing gear, we see it lean over there. Hopefully Bob won't roll it down the hill as he attempts to climb back aboard. And a quick jump, and yes, he manages to grab the ladder, and the spacecraft doesn't move. And he is making his way back in, where we're going to recover this back to the KSE. Except that his standing up animation seems to have knocked him over the other side. Bob, perhaps we should plant another row of ladders on this side. Anyway, jumping forward to something a little more interesting. We are out on the launch pad launching a new probe. This is a mission bound for the moon, and I have been doing a little bit of testing in trying to get something of a standard launcher built. Because what I've generally been doing lately is building sort of bespoke launchers to carry my missions into orbit and out into space. So this thing is technically capable of launching about 6 tons. The first stage involves these solid fuel boosters, and then we get into a liquid stage. All of these are KW rocketry parts, and as we reach burnout and ignite the second stage and begin to make our turn, we see things get a little bit squirrely. It may be to do with the gimbling on the engines and the fact that I have slapped 2 fins on there. I thought the fins may help with stability, but they seem to have made things a little bit worse. But I think that once we get into the second stage of this launch vehicle, things start to stabilize, and we lose all of those rotational problems. Some work to still be done on that, but it is more than capable, as I say, of getting about 6 tons into orbit. This mission, of course, doesn't weigh quite that much. This is a little over 3 tons, and it is bound for the moon. It is a 2-stage probe. One with a Kethane survey unit that we are going to pop into a polar orbit, and also a small lander that we are going to pop down on the surface. You see me activating the Kethane scanner there to be sure that everything is functioning properly after the high G-forces experienced during launch. And we basically fly a pretty standard orbital insertion and get ourselves ready for departure to the moon. Now this Wildcat engine again is a KW rocketry part and is not ideal for space, but with the lifting requirements of this vehicle, I just decided to leave it in. While it doesn't get the best ISP, it does have plenty of thrust for lifting heavier loads into orbit. So I think what I'm doing is I'm just going to wait for moonrise and just burn. I'm not going to bother setting up any maneuver nodes. And there we go, lighting up that engine and sending ourselves out towards the moon. So this upper stage is going to handle pretty much all of our manoeuvring. Hopefully we will be able to begin the landing with this, but I'm not entirely sure. Certainly we'll be able to get ourselves out to the moon and encounter it. Now this probe does have to split into two as we make our way out there, because of course trying to correct from an equatorial orbit into a polar orbit is going to be somewhat difficult. So the plan is to skip forward to the midway point and start breaking this spacecraft apart. So I very carefully select the decoupler and eject the scanning module. So this is going to adjust its course and put itself into a polar orbit around the moon, where we will be able to begin scanning for methane and looking for landing sites and things like that. And you see me setting up a maneuver here to bring it into a polar orbit. You'll also notice that we are kind of orbiting in the wrong plane with respect to the sun. That fact that the probe is going to be dipping down behind the moon is going to be blocking out its solar energy, because this thing of course does not have any RTGs, because that technology is not available to us just yet. So I switch back to the main vehicle once again, and I think it is time to get rid of that stack decoupler on the front. And before doing that, I decide it is probably worth turning the spacecraft a little bit just to get that onto a slightly different orbit. And this thing is incredibly heavy. That upper stage could do with a reaction wheel or something, which might also help us during launch. And so we select the decoupler, and we decouple and send it off on a slightly different trajectory so that it doesn't crash into our methane scanning probe. It's still going to smash into the moon and make sure that we don't leave any debris in space, but it is also not going to interact, hopefully not going to interact with our orbital probe. There you can see me adjusting the spacecraft. I neglected to put any batteries on that stage, and so it's going to be a struggle to make sure that I can keep it charged up. Switching back to the methane probe to make its inclination change, we get ourselves, I decide to cut it out a little bit early and leave myself with a slightly lower periapsis, and just set up a maneuver to bring this into orbit. And I think, and what I'm doing there is I'm trying to correct the plane of the orbit, because it's often better to do these things all in one go. But I think ultimately I decide to just get it into a captured orbit and make my corrections once I get down there. So yeah, you can just see me plotting a maneuver node to for Kerbal alarm clock, so that I can come back to this ship at the right moment, so that it doesn't escape from the moon's sphere of influence. And of course the lander is still on a collision course with the surface of the moon, and that is something that we don't want. We want it to land, but we want it to land gently. So it is heading for the surface, but not at these speeds. So we spin the spacecraft once again very slowly. This is a very, very heavy spacecraft, and it doesn't have an awful lot of torque. Now, as I plot the maneuver to bring myself in to a captured orbit, I discover that I'm kind of orbiting with a little bit of inclination. So I decide that I'm going to cancel that out at this point and just tweak the maneuver node there a little bit. And I might as well burn this pretty early, because 40 minutes from now, there's not a hell of a lot of difference when you're out in space like that and moving around relatively slowly. So I just decide to swing the spacecraft around. I really must put a reaction wheel on that upper stage for future missions. It'll probably decrease the amount of payload it can bring to orbit, but it may make things a little bit easier to control. So just setting up my capture maneuver there. Mostly just doing that for Kerbal alarm clock so that I can manage these two spacecraft as they make their way around. Again, making sure that the solar panel is facing in the right direction. And so coming over the poles with the orbiter, I begin my burn and just capture. I decide not to make my maneuver too low. We see ourselves picking up a contract there because, of course, we've got quite a number of contracts at this time to explore the moon. And in fact, I think this mission will satisfy most of them except for planting a flag. But I thought it would be a better idea to send an unmanned mission out before, or an uncrewed mission, should I say, because Kerbals are not men. They are little green aliens. And so anyway, I set up a burn to sort of correct the plane of my orbit so that I am going to be in sunlight as I go around. It's not exactly polar, but that will actually work to our advantage as we cycle through a couple of orbits. We will be missing out on a bit of data around the poles themselves, but because of the terrain that's there, I don't see myself landing or doing too many landings there, or at least I'm not going to be setting up a mining operation around the poles of the moon. The terrain is quite difficult up there. The mountains very high and steep. And so we make our way down to the thing, only to be interrupted by a Kerbal alarm clock once again. An absolutely invaluable tool when running missions like this, and running any kind of mission, because there's a lot going on and you don't want to miss your maneuvers. And so we light up that engine once again and bring ourselves down into a captured orbit and attempt to make it as circular as possible. There we see my periapsis is dropping a little bit low and my apoapsis is still quite high, so I swing this very heavy spacecraft around again and begin burning in the radial, or is it anti-radial direction, and I end up with something about 19 by 13-ish, 13 and a half kilometers, and begin at work on getting some more of that contract. We have to transmit some scientific data back from orbit around the moon. And so I deal with that and attempt to fold away the antenna. We of course got no signs from that because we've been out here already gathering temperature data from orbit around the moon. There we see the Minmus lander making its launch, which will be rendezvousing with the moon in about 17 days time. Perhaps it will get a glimpse of these new generation of spacecraft. And so it is time to correct the plane of this orbit and bring ourselves up. And we are just going to trim our periapsis there a little bit to bring ourselves down a little bit lower. It is worth getting as low as possible with these probes. It isn't like the new resource scanning in the base game these days. Kethane, we actually have to sit with the probe and follow it around as it tracks over the body in question and gives us data about, I think it's about I want to say it's a kilometre by kilometre area, but I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, you basically have to sit on the probe and allow it to complete its scan. So there you see me trying to find the correct direction to burn in order to bring this into a relatively circular orbit. And yeah, it's about 16 by 12 kilometers there, and I just make sure to point my solar panels because this thing consumes quite a bit of electricity. And I suppose before I attempt the landing, it is worth scanning over the surface. Perhaps we have some photographic cameras on that, searching for a landing site as well as the Kethane before we bring our crewed missions out here and before we attempt landing our little automated lander, which we will probably do in the next episode. Until then, I am going to say thank you very much for tuning in. You have been watching Bloomer Brown on YouTube, and I will see you next time.